On her 18th birthday, a girl was handed a cracked suitcase and shown the door with nothing but a frayed wool coat and a name she had never been allowed to keep. What was sewn inside that suitcase wasn't just fabric. It was the map to everything she had ever been owed. If you've ever felt like the world decided your worth before you ever had a chance to prove it, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. The day I turned 18, the world gave me two things: a suitcase and a deadline. Mrs. Gable said it with the same voice she used to announce dinner times and curfew violations. Flat, measured, efficient. She set the suitcase on the edge of the desk and slid a manila envelope across the laminate surface without looking up. The suitcase was not new. It had never been new. Not for me, at least. The brown leather was splitting at the corners, the brass clasps dulled to the color of old pennies, and one of the hinges had been repaired with a strip of electrical tape that had long since gone brittle. I recognized it. It had been left in the storage room since I arrived at Calloway House at the age of 7. No one had ever told me it was mine. I found out that morning only because Mrs. Gable said so. The office smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant the way it always did, the way every room and every place I had ever lived seemed to smell. I had packed my own things the night before, knowing the morning would come the way mornings always did in this life, without ceremony, without softness. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 t-shirts, a worn paperback copy of a book about a woman who walked across a desert alone, and a photograph, creased down the middle, of a woman I didn't remember but had been told was my grandmother. I tucked it carefully between the pages of the book so the fold wouldn't deepen. Mrs. Gable slid a check across the desk. $250. She called it a transitional stipend. She told me the shelter on Marsh Street had beds available, that the workforce office on 5th opened at 8, that I should carry my documentation with me at all times. She told me, "Good luck, Leo," and her eyes were already moving toward the clock on the wall before she finished saying it. Outside, the sky was the color of wet concrete, and a thin sleet was falling at a diagonal, the kind that doesn't quite count as rain but soaks you through just the same. I stood on the front steps of Calloway House with the suitcase in one hand and the manila envelope in the other. I hadn't opened the envelope yet. There was something in the weight of it that made me want to wait, the way you hold a letter from someone you love for a moment before reading it, knowing that once you open it, the uncertainty is gone forever. The sleet ticked against the pavement. A car passed through a puddle at the curb and threw a cold arc of water across my shoes. I tucked the envelope inside my coat and started walking. I had no idea the envelope in my hand was about to change everything. I found the office of Mr. Alistair Finch on the 3rd floor of a building 2 blocks from the transit station, up a staircase that smelled of old paper and something faintly sweet like furniture polish or dried flowers. The door had his name on it in gold letters that had begun to peel at the edges. I knocked. He called me in before I had finished knocking. He was a small, neat man with thin white hair combed carefully to one side, and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles he looked at me over rather than through. His desk was buried under folders and yellow legal pads, and the one window behind him let in a gray square of winter light that fell across everything like a fine dust. He did not offer condolences. He did not smile. He pulled a folder from beneath a stack of others with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 10,000 times, and folded his hands on top of it. He said my full name once, as though confirming I was real, and then he began to explain. My grandmother, Eleanor Vance, had passed 7 months earlier. She had left no money, no savings account, no stocks or bonds. What she had left, sole and entire, was property, 45 acres in the hill country outside Delwood, a 4-hour bus ride east of the city. There was a farmhouse on the property, he said, though he used the word loosely. There was no well. The road access was a dirt track that flooded twice a year. The county had flagged it twice for code violations. The property taxes were in arrears. To claim the deed, I would owe $7 in outstanding transfer fees. He looked at me over his spectacles and said nothing more for a moment, letting it settle. Then he opened a drawer and withdrew a second envelope, this one sealed with a business stamp. A company called Summit Creek Estates had already made an inquiry. They were prepared to offer $4,000 for the land, as is, waiving all fees. He slid the envelope across the desk and set it beside the deed. I stared at the numbers. $4,000, a deposit on an apartment, a bus ticket to somewhere warmer, food, real food, for the first time in months without rationing. I could feel it, the weight of it, the logic of it. A condemnable farmhouse on land with no water, no road, no power. $4,000. It made every kind of sense. I sat there for a long moment with Mr. Finch watching me quietly over his spectacles, and then I heard myself say the words before I understood I had decided them. I'm not selling. It's mine. I want to see it. He didn't argue. He wrote me a receipt for the $7 and told me the deed would be filed by end of week. It was the stupidest decision I had ever made. It was the best. The bus left at 6 in the morning from the depot on Canal Street. I sat in the back with the suitcase across my knees because the overhead rack was broken and I didn't trust it on the floor. The city unspooled past the windows in slow strips of gray. Tire shops, chain link, a gas station lit up white in the early dark, a billboard for a mattress company whose edges had begun to curl. Then the buildings thinned and the highway opened up, and the light changed, going softer, going greenish, as the trees began to close in on either side of the road. I found a payphone at a rest stop outside of Tully and called my sister Maya. She was still at Callaway House, still 15, still counting days on a calendar she kept taped inside the back cover of a library book. She picked up on the second ring. I told her I was going east, that there was land, that there was a farmhouse. She asked if it had a roof. I told her mostly, and she laughed a little and then went quiet. I told her I was going to fix it up. I was going to make it a home, and then I was going to come back for her. I promise. I said I heard her breathe out slowly on the other end, the way she did when she was deciding whether to believe something. She said, "Okay, Leo." I said I'd write as soon as I had an address. The bus horn sounded from the lot. I ran. The air outside Delwood smelled of pine and cold mud, and something deeper underneath. Something mineral, like stone after rain. I got off at the county depot, a gravel lot with a rusted flagpole and a hand-lettered sign for a diner called Martha's across the road. I crossed over. The bell above the door rang when I walked in. A woman behind the counter with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun looked up without warmth but without hostility either. Just the frank assessment of a woman who had seen everyone who had ever passed through a small town and knew, usually within 30 seconds, what they were about. I asked about a taxi or anyone willing to drive out to the Vance property. She stopped wiping the counter. She said that name slowly, like she was turning it over. Vance. Eleanor Vance. I told her Eleanor was my grandmother. She looked at me for a long moment, then refilled her own coffee without being asked, poured one for me without being asked either, and set it down. She said, "Son, you look like you've been through a war and lost twice." Then she said Eleanor was a good woman who fought harder for this land than anyone she'd ever known, and that her neighbor George had a truck and owed Martha a favor. She picked up the phone. The drive out took 40 minutes on roads that went from paved to gravel to barely rutted dirt. George said nothing the whole way, which I was grateful for. When he stopped the truck at the top of a rise and pointed down through the tree line, I leaned forward and looked. The farmhouse sat in a shallow hollow, surrounded by scrub and second-growth oak, the paint gone entirely on the south-facing wall, the porch roof sagging at one end, two of the front windows boarded with plywood. The chimney had lost its cap. The steps were rotted through at the center. A rusted iron weather vane on the ridge had frozen in place, pointing perpetually east. What I saw waiting for me there made me want to turn around. I'm glad I didn't. The key on the ring for Mr. Finch's envelope was old, skeleton style, the kind cut for a mortise lock. I walked down through the wet grass to the front door and fitted it into the lock, and turned. The lock resisted, then groaned, the tumblers grinding like something waking up from a long sleep, and then there was a solid, satisfying clunk. And the door swung inward. A wave of air rolled out to meet me, musty and thick, the smell of damp earth and rust and trapped time, old wood and something underneath it that I couldn't name, something almost sweet. I stepped inside. The interior was dark except for 3 shafts of dusty light falling through gaps in the boards over the windows, cutting across the floorboards at long angles. The space was larger than it looked from outside. High-ceilinged, bare. My footsteps echoed back at me from the corners. Dust motes rose and turned slowly in the light. There was something in the silence of it, in the scale of it, that felt almost like standing inside a church, like something meant to hold more than just weather. Then I saw it. In the center of the main room, directly under the highest rafter, sitting into one clean shaft of winter light that came through a gap in the roof, The suitcase. Not my suitcase, the brown cracked one I'd carried from Callaway House. This one was different. Older, larger, black leather, hard-sided, the kind from another era, with brass fittings that had been polished once and recently. It sat on the floor as though it had been placed there with intention, as though it had been waiting. I approached it slowly. The clasps were stiff, but they opened. I lifted the lid. The smell that rose from it was strange and particular. Old fabric and cedar and something waxy like candle remnant. The interior was packed with fabric, folded pieces, layered carefully the way someone packs when they have all the time in the world and care about what they are packing. I lifted the first piece. It was a dress, cream-colored, hand-stitched, the kind of quality you understand with your fingers before your eyes catch up. I set it aside. Beneath it, more fabric. And then, packed flat against the base, something that crinkled when my fingers touched it. I pressed along the bottom lining of the suitcase and felt it, a seam that didn't match the others. Someone had opened the lining and re-sewn it shut. Someone had sewn something inside. I worked carefully along the edge until the stitching gave. I peeled back the lining. Beneath it, flat as a pressed flower, were documents, and bound with rubber bands and packets of dry, crisp bills was cash. I counted the first packet with shaking hands. $1,000. I counted again. 1,000. I set it aside and opened the next. Then the next. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. 9 packets. $9,000 in the lining of an old black suitcase, and beneath the money, a legal document in a plastic sleeve, and beneath that, a letter sealed with wax. I sat down hard on the cold floorboards. My legs had stopped cooperating. I looked at the ceiling, at the shaft of light, at the dust turning slowly in it, and a strange, choked sound came out of me that echoed off the walls before I understood it was laughter. Then the laughter turned into something else. A deep, gut-wrenching sob that I had been carrying for 11 years and had never once had a private enough place to set down. I stayed there on the floor for a long time. When I finally reached for the letter, the wax seal cracked cleanly down the middle, as if it had been waiting for exactly the right pressure. It was addressed to me by name. The handwriting was unsteady but precise. The letters formed with the careful deliberateness of someone whose hands had grown uncertain, but whose mind had not. Leo, if you are reading this, it means you are 18 and the world has finally given you back to yourself. I am sorry I could not be there when that happened. I am sorry for all the years I could not be there. But I need you to understand something before you read another word. I never stopped fighting for you. Not for a single day. I set the letter down, picked it up again. Read those 2 sentences twice more. She wrote that when I was 6 years old, a man named Carver, her late husband's former business partner, had filed a fraudulent claim against the property and against her personally, alleging debts she did not owe. He had threatened to have my mother's parental rights reviewed by the county on fabricated evidence, using a lawyer she could not afford to fight. My grandmother had made a calculation. If she kept fighting publicly, she would lose everything, including me. If she stepped back, if she let the system take me temporarily while she worked quietly, she could protect the land, pay the fraudulent debt down over years, and eventually reclaim what was ours. She had believed it would take 3 years. It took 11. She had not planned to die before it was finished. She wrote, "The money in the lining is yours free and clear. I saved it in cash for 17 years, so no one could touch it. But the money is not the inheritance. Read the document in the plastic sleeve. Read it slowly." I set the letter aside and opened the plastic sleeve. The document inside was a survey, sealed with a county stamp, dated 4 years prior. It outlined in the careful language of bureaucratic fact that beneath the 45 acres of the Vance property, at a depth of 60 to 90 feet below the primary rock shelf, there existed an aquifer, not a small one. The survey described it as one of the largest private freshwater aquifers identified in the county, capable of supplying upward of 300 households annually. The document noted that water rights to the aquifer had been registered in the name of Eleanor Vance in perpetuity and would transfer with the deed. She had written one final line at the bottom of her letter, underlined twice with a steady hand. The water is the foundation. Everything starts with the foundation. I stood in the center of the room, the letter in one hand, the survey in the other, the $9,000 spread across the floorboards around me. And I thought about a woman I barely remembered who had spent 17 years making sure the floor I was standing on would hold. The weeks that followed, were unlike anything I had known. I slept the first 2 nights in a sleeping bag on the floor of the farmhouse, and on the third day I walked into Delwood and found George at his hardware store. He looked at me over the counter with the patient expression of a man who understood what a person looked like when they had just decided something, and he let me run a tab. I bought tarps, nails, a handsaw, rope, and 2 gallons of exterior primer. He threw in a pair of leather work gloves without being asked. Back at the farmhouse, I patched the worst sections of the roof with tarp, crawled along the porch ceiling, and found the rot, cut it out, replaced the boards with salvaged planks from a collapsed outbuilding at the back of the property. My hands blistered, then hardened. I hauled water from a spring creek at the property's eastern edge in 2 5-gallon buckets, twice a day, until the shoulder that had carried them stopped complaining. I read everything I could find at the Delwood Public Library about water rights, about aquifer law, about easement agreements and land leases. The librarian, a quiet woman who never asked what I was looking at, left a county land code manual on the table where I usually sat. I didn't thank her because I didn't know if she meant it for me. I read it anyway. Martha from the diner appeared one afternoon with a cardboard box containing 4 pots, a cast-iron skillet, 2 mismatched plates, and a jar of coffee. She set it inside the door without explanation and left. A retired electrician named Henry came by the following Tuesday, said he'd heard about the situation from George, looked at the wiring, shook his head slowly, and spent 2 full days grounding the whole house for nothing but the lunch I made him from rice and canned beans on the wood stove I had coaxed back to life with a wire brush and a can of stove polish. 3 weeks after I moved in, a letter arrived forwarded to Mr. Finch's office. Summit Creek Estates had revised their offer. $25,000. Waive all rights, transfer within 45 days, no contingencies. I read it at the kitchen table and set it face down on the wood. 4 days after that, a second letter arrived. Not an offer this time. A notice. Summit Creek Estates had filed a petition with the county arguing that the property constituted a public safety blight and requesting the authority to pursue condemnation proceedings. I walked into Delwood the next morning and called Mr. Finch from the payphone outside the post office. He told me to come in. He told me to bring the survey. I walked into the Summit Creek Estates lawyer's office, not knowing it would be the most important meeting of my life. There were 2 of them at the conference table, both in dark suits, both with the polished ease of men who had done this many times and expected to do it many more. They spoke about community development, about regional progress, about the burden of managing rural property in the modern county. They smiled the way people smile when they believe the conversation is already over, and they are simply being courteous about it. Then they slid a figure across the table. $250,000, cash settlement, clean transfer, no encumbrances. The room was quiet. I looked at the number. I thought about the feeling of hauling water in the early morning when the frost was still on the grass. The weight of it, the way the shoulder ached at the end of each trip. I thought about Maya, still in Callaway House, still counting days. I thought about Eleanor Vance sitting at a kitchen table for 17 years, folding bills into the lining of a suitcase and sewing it shut with the patience of someone who knew that the important things take longer than they should. I said no. One of them leaned forward slightly. I continued before he could speak. I laid the survey on the table. I explained, with Mr. Finch at my elbow, that the aquifer beneath the Vance property represented a water supply that the entire eastern county would require within the next 2 decades as development expanded. I said I was willing to negotiate a long-term easement for water access, not a sale, not a transfer of any kind, but a lease renewable on 20-year terms, with the following conditions. Priority water rates for all existing Delwood residents, fixed for the duration of any agreement. A conservation covenant restricting any surface development within 300 feet of the aquifer head. An annual fee. Indexed to a community land trust I intended to establish in Eleanor Vance's name. And full right of termination if any condition was breached. The man on the left stopped smiling. The man on the right wrote something on a legal pad and turned it face down. Neither of them answered. They gathered their folders. They thanked me for my time with the automatic courtesy of men who had not expected to need it. They left. Mr. Finch looked at me over his spectacles for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "Your grandmother would have enjoyed that." The contract was signed 6 weeks later. Summit Creek Estates agreed to every condition. I don't know if they had a choice or simply decided the easement was preferable to years of litigation over a water source they needed. Regardless, it didn't matter. The annual fee was enough to pay the property taxes, service the farmhouse, and cover two living expenses. It was not a fortune. It was enough was something I had never had before. I drove to the courthouse in Delwood on a Thursday morning in March with the custody paperwork Mr. Finch had filed on my behalf. Maya came out the front doors wearing a green coat that was slightly too big for her, carrying a paper bag with everything she owned. She looked at the farmhouse for the first time from the truck window as we came down the long track through the trees, the chimney smoke rising, the new porch boards pale against the old weathered frame, the windows lit from inside. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she reached over and flipped the light switch on the wall just inside the door, and the overhead bulb came on clean and bright, real electricity for the first time in the house in years. She stood there in the light and said, "You did it, Leo." And I heard in her voice the same thing I had been trying to explain to myself for months, that this was not luck, and it was not miracle, and it was not charity. It was Eleanor Vance, patient and deliberate, building a floor that would hold long after she was gone. I stand on the porch sometimes now in the early morning before Maya is awake, and the light is just beginning to move through the oak branches, and I think about a brown cracked suitcase sitting on the edge of a laminate desk, and a woman with tired eyes who said, "Good luck, Leo," and never looked up. I think about how close I came to taking the $4,000 and walking away from everything that was already mine. I think about 9 packets of bills sewn into a lining by hands I never got to hold as an adult, by a woman who believed that what she was building would find me eventually, even if she wasn't there to hand it to me herself. Home isn't something you find. It's something someone starts building before you know you need it, and it's your job to finish it. The most valuable things are never in the obvious places. They are in the lining. They are in the foundation. They are in the letter written by someone who loved you long before you could understand what love like that costs. If you have ever felt like the world decided you were worth nothing before you ever opened your mouth, I want you to know that feeling is a lie that other people put in you. It does not belong to you. You don't have to carry it. Tell me in the comments about a time someone built something for you that you didn't understand until later. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.